NWP Radio.
You're listening to NWP Radio, a production of the National Writing Project.
NWP. NWP Radio.
Hello, hello, hello. It's official. It's the new school year, and the wonderful crazy is taking off once again. Woo woo, for the excitement of it all. My name is Brian Ripley Crandall, and I'm fortunate to co-host this show, The Right Time, with my friend, my mentor, Tanya Baker, Director of National Programs. I'm equally fortunate to bring forward tonight's guests and to feel a little more giddy than usual, and I know that might be difficult for Tanya to comprehend. Yes, my enthusiasm is so large for all these shows, but tonight I'm bringing this way closer to home. Tanya, are you ready to help debut a spectacular resource for writing educators everywhere that has just launched?
Well, Brian, it's always a pleasure to work with you. And you know that's what I want to do, primarily more than anything. And I remember you telling me last year after we recorded a show that we must invite memoirist Sonya Huber to be a guest on The Right Time. Her book, Voice First, A Writer's Manifesto, is out this fall. And you have had the pleasure of knowing and working with Sonya for over a decade. She's an intellectual guide, and she's one heck of a writer. As you say, she brilliantly illuminates the intricate paths writers can take to shape their voices on the page. Yes, you've been raging about this upcoming teaching resource for over a year, and I am excited to have the author with us tonight. The book is finally out, and teachers across the network are going to love this.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you 150%, maybe 151%. So Sonya is one of my muses. She's a neighbor, she's a colleague, she's a friend, and one of the best workshop presenters in the universe. They're amazing. You want her to come to your school and do a presentation. It's outstanding. So teachers in Connecticut have been so fortunate to learn from her brilliance in our summer institutes. Sometimes, though, I sometimes really wonder if she's just a part of my imagination, simply because she's just so magical. So when I got asked to review Voice First over a year ago, I called her and said, after I read it, "Oh my God, you have written the missing link that so many of us have needed our entire careers." Wow. Educators are going to love, L-O-V-E, love this book. More officially, Sonya Huber is the author of 7 books, including a new guide, Voice First, A Writer's Manifesto, and the award-winning essay collection on chronic pain, Pain Woman Takes Your Keys, and Other Essays from a Nervous System. Her other books include Supremely Tiny Acts, A Memoir in a Day, Opa Nobody, Cover Me, A Health Insurance Memoir, and the Backwards Research Guide for Writers. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Brevity, Creative Nonfiction, and other outlets. She teaches at Fairfield University with me and in the Fairfield Low-Residency MFA program. Her students also love her.
Wow. A whole giant reading list. And Brian, I think you need to do a little bit of more full disclosure here. Our teacher guest for this show actually went through the CWP Fairfield Summer Institute twice, only because she wanted to be rejuvenated and revitalized for another academic year. In fact, she returned because she was seeking to rekindle her own voice in writing and teaching. When she did her teacher demonstration on helping middle school youth to find their voice, you shared an advanced copy of Sonya Huber's book with her. The rest is history. It brings us to this evening. Michelle Caruso Walker has been working in education for the last 20 years. She's taught middle school and high school in Connecticut and New York City. Michelle has a PhD from Fordham and currently works in Westport Public Schools as the middle school instructional coach. She's also mom to 3 boys. And yes, she returned to CWP Fairfield, led by the one and only Brian Ripley Crandall, for a second time last year as a writer.
Like I said, it's all family tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to hand it over to Dr. Caruso Walker, who's going to give an opening writing prompt to everybody if they want to stop and record at home. And then we're going to let the two of you have a great conversation, and we're going to go poof and disappear. We will come back in after about 30 minutes, and we'll gauge where the conversation is going, and all will be well. So Michelle, it's all yours.
Okay, great. So this writing prompt actually comes from the book we're about to discuss, specifically chapter 3, Voices Live in the Body. Try to put yourself in the mindset of a kid you used to be. It might be helpful to pick a specific age. Think about what you like to do at that age, or your favorite things or moments of comfort and joy. Then write from that point of view. Children are often bold, physical, and a little feral. What was your wild voice like? And what would it say to the reader?
Ooh, I'm going to go down memory lane. All right. Mwah. Have a great conversation.
Okay. Hi, Sonya.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. It's so nice to meet you.
And likewise, definitely.
So I'm going to jump into questions and then let me know if you have a question for me.
Okay, awesome.
The title of the book is Voice First.
Mhm.
And too often in my teaching experience, voice seemed to be discussed last, after organization, evidence, transitions, etc. Why did you title the book Voice First?
My main idea was that for me, after really trying every other possible approach, I sort of came to the idea that voice for me and voices are what impel everything else. So, rather than being sort of this mysterious secret sauce you put on at the end, that it's the generative muscle that makes the writing move and expressive and provides ideas.
Yeah. And this is kind of connected to that, but one of the ideas that really stood out to me in the beginning, the opening of your book, is that we just have one voice as writers, we have multiple voices.
Mm-hmm.
That focus on the plurality of voice really struck me. You described like voice as a river, as a braid, having many layers. And how did you arrive at that idea? Why is it important to talk about voices and not a single voice?
I think, just over the years of teaching writing and being in writing classrooms, like the advice to find your voice just seemed so mystifying to me because I didn't know where it was, and I think what it does is it sets up a reader, or it sets up a writer to feel as though their expression is supposed to be a little different than who they are. Like their voice is somewhere outward. And, I've seen so many students who, as it is, are already, they feel so alienated and separate from their expression that I think the mystery, the lack of clarity around, that definition of a single voice just made me want to really unpack it, look at the scholarship, and then also explore what would happen if I gave myself all of these writing prompts. So,
did you actually do all of the writing prompts? I mean, I want to talk about that a little bit later, but did you do all the writing prompts yourself?
Oh yeah, I do. It's voice work is now one of the main things that I do with my writing. And it's also, I think it's also one of the things that continues to be the most difficult for me. I often know if I'm working on a book, like this voice is wrong for this project.
Okay.
And then I have had a couple of books where I have tried to write the book in multiple voices. And, part of the effect of some of those Frankensteins has been to really see like, I can rewrite this book 7 times and there actually are voices that are kind of layered in on top of each other. And that seems to work in some way. And then, that got me thinking. And then, as always, I go to the writing of other authors that I love for inspiration. And I always wish I was Annie Dillard. She's this beautiful writer who wrote Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And so her voice is so fascinating to me. I wish I could channel it. But then in going back and teaching that book with my students in a writing place class, like a number of years ago, it struck me really strongly, like it's not one voice. Like she actually has sort of tones that she shifts in and out of. So I think, close reading of a book that I've loved and have read several times kind of was that final like aha moment of like, I'm trying to put myself into a box. And the answer is instead to get broader.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, as Brian mentioned, he had shared a little bit of this with me, and I did return to CWP because I had been doing some academic writing and I just wasn't writing. I just didn't sound like me. I was going back and forth. And when I come back to it, it is me. It's just a version. But I had felt stuck, like, what's my writer's voice? And So reading this was incredibly helpful, but it's nice to know it's kind of a common experience that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's especially common, because I teach academic writing, and students who have done academic writing for so many years that they forget that there's other options, or they haven't really been given the choice to explore those other options. And so then, the most horrible thing to hear as a writing teacher is, I hate writing. And like in some ways, like that, hearing that from students, it's such a heartbreaking thing, and it makes me want to give them the options of trying all these different things. And then usually what they find is like, oh, I just don't really feel connected to this voice, but I do to these 7 or 8, which is, I think what matters to me.
Sure. That's kind of, and this is like a personal question I've been thinking about a little bit, but I always wonder about writers' confidence. Like my students, either they write way too much because they're not really confident, and I usually teach middle school, or they just don't write enough. And it seems to me like it's like a confidence thing. Like they don't feel like either comfortable in what they're writing, or they're so uncomfortable that they're writing so much. And I was curious, do you think that like owning your voice or finding one of these voices that works for you would impact writers' confidence?
Yes, totally. And in fact, like, this always what happens to me. Like I finish a book, it goes off to the publisher, and then I realize something that is like the next level. But I've been totally thinking about this, the question of voice and authority. And yes, I have found just through thinking about this and working with students that there's a way in which, if I am broadening out the range of voices I can use, often those voices are tied to different identities that I have, right? And each of those identities isn't just about me. So there's a way in which, in doing sort of playing with voices, I'm reminded that, oh yes, I'm one among many people from the Midwest. I'm one among many pain people. And somehow there's a way in which, because I often really struggle with authority in writing myself, like that question, I think that's always in our heads of like, well, who's going to care, and something about listening to all these voices gives me the confidence to say, I'm speaking from lived experience in a way, as opposed to sort of, the disembodied academic head who it really is hard to feel passion sometimes, or a sense of lived experience through that academic voice. So yeah, I'm still mulling over that too, but I think there's something about being having students know that, or having students only try the academic voice, that of course, like, because they're not academics, of course they're not going to feel authority like in that role. Do you know what I mean? And so yeah, it's sort of like we're setting them up in a way, if that's the only thing we're asking them to do.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen that in my own classroom. And it also seems a little bit to connect to when we do what's supposed to be fun writing, when we do like narrative writing or anything, when we do play with fiction. There's also that hesitation. And one of the kind of cliches of teaching that I've said before is like that show, don't tell. And you address that in your book. It comes up in chapter 7. And it is kind of outdated advice. I always feel like I hear my old teachers' voices when I say it.
Same.
So full disclosure, I've said it. But what should teachers know about the importance of details and voice? Is there better advice than show, don't tell?
I mean, I think sort of like the nonfiction writers have come up with this new cliche for our workshops, which I don't know if it's better, but that we often say show and tell.
Right.
But yeah, I think there's, and it makes sense that we would say show, don't tell, because, the sort of home ground for writing workshops was the fiction workshop, right? And so I think a lot of our pedagogy comes from fiction writing. But so when I learned nonfiction, I talk about this in the book, that it was sort of based on the model of fiction writing. And so I took show don't tell into my nonfiction work, which, you know, I think really was the core of some of the voice problems that I have. Because, right, in a way, what that's doing is it's doing a version of academic writing in saying, like, don't talk about what's going on in your subjective experience, just report what's in front of you, you know? And so there's a way in which, in trying to do that perfectly, I was not trusting my own reflective voice.
Right. It's still limiting in a way.
Yeah.
I've been trying out yes and, which is an old improv.
Oh yeah. I love that.
But I'm always looking for a way to like include more and then work from there, opposed to feeling like my kids freeze up when
yeah
start with
definitely.
their writing.
I mean, I think as far as like my absolute favorite thing when to help students who are frozen up is to talk about what annoys them. And so, like, yeah, I have a chapter in here on anger, but you know, my favorite thing in teaching, and this came out of just desperation one day, teaching introduction to composition a number of years ago. And I gave students an open topic, right? They could research anything.
Right.
And I get that that's a total sort of like, of course your brain would freeze. What do you mean anything? But they just couldn't think of anything. And I was like, you guys, what do you care about? And they were like, you know, I don't know. And so I was like, all right, we're just going to rant. We're going to rant for 5 minutes about everything that annoys you. And as a teacher, I then got one of my most delightful classroom experiences because, like, instead of, you know, like getting all angry and hunched over their pages, they like lit up with delight. Like no one had ever said, like, please be mad, be your irritable, grouchy, annoyed selves, right? And so within the space, they did this and they went off, and I hated to even interrupt them. And then often what they found was that even in the space of 2 to 3 minutes, what started as annoyance turned to inquiry, or turned to questions, or turned in some other direction. So, you know, that really made me think, like, as far as authority goes, we're all often annoyed and grouchy. And I have super sense of authority about what annoys me. So I think that's underutilized as sort of a voice that kind of has endless energy behind it.
And it's such a simple shift from what do you like versus what bothers you. And then all
the
of a
list
sudden,
is always super long, right?
I'm going to remember that because middle schoolers have a lot of complaints. They really do. Oh gosh. Which I think would be really fun. I wish I had focused on maybe one of the prompts from the anger chapter of your book, but I loved the try this sections throughout the text.
Cool.
And I was just curious, like, how did you come up with all of these examples? And do you have a favorite? So my favorites were split. I had 2 and I jotted them down so I didn't forget. Either the voices that help me through the day but don't speak much, because I have a lot of those. I have like an inner monologue a lot of times.
Like, come on, you could do it.
I just need another cup of coffee.
Exactly.
Or writing a speech to an imagined group of pirates or rogue figures to tell them how badass I am. Those were my favorite too. So how did you come up with those? And, you know, do you have a favorite one too?
Oh God, I'd forgotten about the pirate one. But you know, I think some of it comes from like just having, you know, thinking back to like when my son is growing up, right? And like the enormous number of voices that kids are trying out constantly, right? Like little kids.
I have 3 sons,
so yeah, so you see it, right?
My oldest is saying brah a lot, like, come on, brah. And I'm like, okay.
Does he call you brah?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, I feel like that's a rite of passage with boys. Like what?
Typically go by mom, but okay.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Um, but yeah, so something like the pirate voice, for example, is also one of those voices that I will try to work into my own head to counteract some of like the, again, like the loss of confidence or the not feeling like I have anything to contribute to a conversation or whatever. And a lot of those come from like the non-academic parts of my life, you know. And so they've always been really helpful to me in writing essays. And so I think, in the essay and nonfiction world, we do a lot of weird voice stuff. But then I've just been trying to bring that more into the classroom and kind of to be more honest with students about, like, even adults walking around have these voices, right? Like, we look so composed up at the front of the classroom, but we're always constantly annoyed. Like, we've just gotten done, like, making fun of our spouse or them making fun of us or making fun of other teachers, right? So, yeah, I think in some ways our public personas take some of the fun out of expression, but it's actually there. So part of it is just wanting to invite students into that play, knowing that that's also what real writers do.
I did want to ask you a little bit about chapter 8, just because I thought it was really important, which is embodied voices and racialized voices. And I taught in Upper Manhattan for 5 years, and I still like doubt some stuff that I did with my students and work on voice and what voice is supposed to sound like. So I just think the idea of preferred standard voice, that like kind of all American, you call it like the white voice, being associated with the rules. And initially I thought of code switching when I started that chapter, which you also addressed, because that was a big term when I was working
when I first was sort of learning writing pedagogy, that was the same way. It was sort of like the ideal, people just do this, right?
And I feel like I even went on some PD that was talking about code switching. And so as a teacher, I felt confident with that. But, thinking about it more today and reading your chapter, I'm just wondering about ways that writers and their teachers can protect voices that have been restricted or silenced. And I had mentioned to Brian, he said definitely include it, that NCTE just came out with a statement about writing instruction, and they do address the fact that certain rules are preferred and what that does to voice and to young writers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think too, this is one way in particular that if you're gonna allow students to practice multiple voices in the classroom, sort of my model or my ideal, I'm assuming this works for others because it does work for me, is that you can generate thoughts using multiple voices and great ideas that then might go into some other document. So, and I think, academics also have been doing this for years. I was just looking at something that I think was, I don't know what journal it was covered, but it was a completely scholarly journal, but it was a guy writing from working class experience, working class guy. And he wrote this academic article. It was about rants, so of course I had to download it. But it was all in like the dialect that he would normally use to express himself, like his home voice. So, right, I think there's a huge danger in sort of making the academic and thoughtful voice be too rigid, right? So, and I think too that also comes down to the issue of being honest with students about what writing process is like. Like so often, like the thing that ends up for me with like a very fancy footnoted whatever, starts as a bunch of like more here, XXX, finish that up, where does this go, right? Like it's a mess.
Yes.
And so I think, you know, that we can also, like, no matter where our students are coming from, we can let them be themselves on the page, and then maybe help them to not squash their enthusiasm and voices until they're completely satisfied with the final form. So, you know, we can teach our students, I think, multiple genres, including academic writing. But yeah, I think even academic writing is loosening up a little bit and realizing, I mean, really how harmful and violent it can be to tell someone that their voice and their method of expression is less thoughtful.
Right. And I think, I mean, in my experience, both with my sons, but also as a teacher, I feel like that happens, it starts to happen in middle school, where I feel like there's a lot of voice play or just freedom in the elementary school writing that I see my boys come home with. And then when I walk into middle school classes, we just have a lot of like organizers and sentence starters and acronyms, and it's a quick shift. And I don't think it has to be like that.
Middle school and like, right. And just like
the shift seems to happen, and then all of a sudden it's like limited. And then I also was thinking about what you had said about academic writing and how some of the restrictions are loosening a little bit. And I'm just hoping that trickles down, because so often what I hear is like, oh, you have to get ready for high school and middle school, or oh, you have to get ready for college. And that seems to be the pressure of limiting voice. And
and I think it might be sort of like which I think one of the reasons why I love the National Writing Project so much is, you know, in its mission to bring together college and K through 12 teachers, is that, I mean, at least from my perspective in the writing classroom, is that there is more looseness in college, and more like, you know, there's been a turn towards more process-based instruction. And so, yeah, I think maybe some teachers might assume that there's more rigidity in college writing based on what there used to be, you know? So
yes, that does make sense. And I also wanted to comment on the messiness and sharing the messiness with students. And I think this is NWP, but when I write, I'll just write cold in front of my kids and start
that's
typing.
awesome.
And, you know, they'll watch me misspell and do backspace and change a word or read it out loud to myself. And I think the more, you know, we can share that messiness might help kids as they're discovering their multiple voices, or also developing confidence, like seeing themselves as writers.
Right. Definitely. And even I think, you know, having fun as they're doing it as a way to sort of realize, you know, like this gives me something, as opposed to just being, you know, like, I'm bad at this, I'm not doing it right, you know?
Right. I know, I always feel bad when they say, well, I'm not a writer. I'm like, yes, you are.
I see you're writing 1,000 things on your phone.
I know. Yes. We're composing all the time. Those videos, it all counts. So I think those connections are super important. So I love talking about students and their writing, but I have to admit, when I first read your book, I thought of myself as a writer. And one of the voices I thought of was my teaching voice. You know, I have a specific persona when I'm teaching. You know, I'm Michelle, I'm mom, but last year when I was in the classroom, the kids would always call me Doc Walk. But yeah, there's 8th graders are a special group. But today, especially for new teachers, since I'm an instructional coach now, there's so much scripted curriculum.
Oh gosh.
And I feel like it gets in the way of like finding that teacher voice. And I know it's not specifically writing, but what do you think about voice in teaching, or finding yourself in those different roles?
I think in some ways, like how I think of my writing and my teaching. Like I sort of grew up both as a writer and a teacher, like always at the same time. And so I feel like teaching and hearing myself explain things to students really has become one element of my writing voice, and especially the version of my teaching persona that is trying to explain things in very simple, relatable, and concrete ways that are also interesting and fun. But yeah, I think too, part of I was just like joking with some of my my colleagues about how every start of the school year I go into my first class and I'm like, what am I doing? Who do I think I am? Like, I actually don't know anything. Like, if students knew what we thought on our first day of school, they just would laugh, you know? And then by the end of the class, I was like, this is going to be awesome. I love this. You guys are going to have so much fun. And so, kind of like the enthusiasm that Brian brought to his intro and that he brings to every day, like, I feel like that has, it's just been, it's one of the joys that I get to do that persona. And I get constant feedback that works.
Right.
And I think that then has changed my writing in a way, right? Like, and I do think that different roles that we play, like, there's writing there in all of them. So yeah, I mean, I think that, but as far as like, this like scripted curriculum, I don't have to deal with that at the college level, but I could totally imagine that would be, it would definitely get in the way of trying to have spontaneous moments in the classroom with your students.
I've been lucky. I've never really used scripted curriculum. And by the time it started to get rolled out in the districts that I was in, I knew who Doc Walk was. I was okay. I had like some one-liners. I felt comfortable in that space. But since I sometimes coach newer teachers and they look through the curriculum, it is written in a voice, but it's not always theirs. And so I'm usually like, this is an amazing resource, but you want to claim your agency. But it's, it's a balance.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's that thing of, you start off, I started off teaching thinking, like, I look 12 years old, so I have to make them respect me, and like sort of start off very like organized. And then after a while realize, oh, like it'll still happen no matter what. And I actually know things, and those things seem to fall out of my mouth, even if like I feel like I'm not doing very well. You know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah, I think part of it is just, the number of years that you find yourself both doing great and having semi little nightmares,
It ebbs and flows. It really does.
What do you write? What kind of stuff do you write?
Me? Well, I was struggling with that because I went through a dissertation process and, I felt like I was writing that forever. Yeah. And after that, I did like a chapter here and there for a book. Like I was trying to find my way. I tried to rewrite that dissertation into a journal article, but, I've been just trying to journal more because when I did Connecticut Writing Project for the second time, I had done it first when I was very young. And then I came back. I was like, I feel like I want to be writing more. And Brian had said to me, well, do you write every day? Do you keep a journal? And I was like, no, I wasn't. So that's been my main goal right now. And sometimes I'll like write a poem or something for fun. And sometimes it's just like a reflection on my day. But I'm trying to use that muscle more.
That's awesome.
I do have some goals like, I should write about this practice that I did and try to, submit to a journal or something. But right now I'm just trying to take it slow and kind of explore the different voices that I have. And I don't know, they're always there. It's not like I'm finding them. I always use the word find, but that's not really true. But just acknowledge them and practice.
Right. And I do think they're all muscles, right? And especially if you've been like, I used to work as a journalist, and after a while, and I still find myself like, it's like a, a shopping cart with a broken wheel. I'll veer in that direction and I'm like, oh my God, I'm doing like reporter voice. No. And then I'll have to pull myself back. But I sort of think it must be the same thing with, post dissertation. Like you want to tend that way, but there's actually so much more out there.
Right. I've been, I have a presentation coming up, so I've been rewriting that, and I go to more of an academic, like, well, no, this is supposed to be this way, and let's transition that way. And I'm like, no, I think this is kind of a more engaging approach, or like I'll play with it. But my go-to for so long has been like, well, no, you can't use I, you got to transition.
Right.
And I'm like, what am I doing? So I'm really trying to catch myself with some of those rules overall. But that's what I've really been trying to journal more. I'll never forget that when I like asked Brian about like, well, I just want to be, and he's like, well, you could journal every day. And I'm like, sounds simple. So I am really trying to work on that, especially because my position is a little like I'm in a transition, and so I've been thinking about.
That's awesome.
So one of the other things that I noticed when I was reading your book is just how many references and different authors and perspectives are included. I mean, Peter Elbow was something.
He's everywhere. Oh, he's the man.
So, and in some of the prompts, some of the try this sections, I was reminded of free writing, or it reminded me of some of the Peter Elbow work that I got to experience, which I should reflect on in my journal. And then like Virginia Woolf was there, Orwell was there, lots of bell hooks, Felicia Rose Chavez. Like there's a lot of different perspectives in here. And I was curious as to why you incorporated so many different voices with your own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like back to the authority thing, right? Like I wanted to make sure, because I have an MFA, but I'm not like, I don't have a PhD. I always feel like I have to compensate a little bit and make sure I know the entire field. But I also wanted to test out and sort of see like this impulse that I have, like, does it fit anywhere? And then when I started to see, I got obsessed with Peter Elbow, and I just read like everything I could get my hands on. And I sent him an email, like I sent him fan mail. Like, yeah, he's been really important to me since I first started teaching. Right. But yeah, I just was, and I'm also always really interested in like where the practice of writing comes together with scholarship about writing. And like where the connection points are, where a writer is getting at the same thing that a scholar is. And I just, like, whenever that happens, especially if it's writers I admire, like Virginia Woolf, for example, then I'm like, okay, this is like, this feels right. And also it makes sense to other people. So yeah. So but it's also just kind of a wonderful chance to like sort of continue my own education.
I mean, it was kind of amazing reading it, because all of those writers have all of these different voices, and you can see it through the excerpts or the quotations that you would include. It was kind of not to be too dramatic, it was like kind of a waterfall for me, like, oh, here it is in this writer, and here's it was a subtle way to like have all of these examples of the power of voice, even though a lot of times they were embedded in a chapter to illustrate, the focus of the chapter.
But you could also see it in their sentences.
Yes.
Oh, that's so cool. Awesome.
Yes. Which I was, I'm like, how do all of these authors have the same? And then of course they do. That's why I want to read them, because
exactly. Yeah. Because there's the complexity of all the different voices, right? And the resonance, which is what makes beautiful writing, I think.
And I found that to be compelling throughout the text. But yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you wove those all together. And my last like official question was, and you kind of hinted about this in the beginning, but if you could tell me a little bit more about it, like which of your voices did you use to write this book?
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's a cool question. I think it definitely comes out of my teaching voice, but
Mhm.
also like there is a part of a very non-academic version of like my persona. Like I call it, I think I at one point call it hayseed punk rock girl, which is like a version of my adolescent and early college years, you know. And yeah, somebody who just loves writing, like is sort of like just in love with it. You know, that was kind of what I was trying to summon, like that sheer joy and excitement, because if that can come through the page, like that's all I want.
So, hey, can you tell me that one more time? With
Yeah, hayseed punk rock girl.
punk rock girl. That's great.
So here's a little backstory, and this is going to be a hard show to close up because I've taken pages of notes. So on my first day at Fairfield University, I think I sat across from, or like she was a couple tables over of Sonya, and she introduced herself, and I was like, okay, I've got a friend. Now, how do I go and meet her? And how do I talk to her? And maybe it was like the pasty punk girl. I'm not sure, like that I was attracted to, the rebel rouser. And one of the things about Voice First that is so amazing is because I know Sonya and I talk to her often, and is that you can hear some of the battlegrounds going on in her head, not only as an academic, not only as a nonfiction writer, but also as somebody who has struggled with some disabilities in the way the United States kind of pushes that upon us, or someone who has left-leaning ideologies and, you know, growing up in the Midwest. So I see those tensions in her writing, and that's what makes her voice. I know we have to go to the prompt, but I just want you to know, this is a secret for the four of us. I figured out a way how we were going to become rich.
Oh.
So I went online and I Googled ranting is delightful as are there coffee mugs? Are there t-shirts?
There should be.
There
really
it
should
does
be.
not exist. It doesn't. You heard it here first. Sonya Huber, ranting is delightful. And
That's
anybody who knows me, who goes through my writing project, they know how much I rant about people who leave grocery carts out in the parking lot. It is my number one pet peeve. I'm like, why do you leave them? Like just walk it, get your extra steps in, bring it back to the front of the store. Anyway, so remember, ranting is delightful. And wow,
we're gonna be rich.
I mean, okay, so here we got to go to the last prompt. So go to the prompt. Michelle, what was your last prompt?
Oh, okay. My last prompt is the second part of the first one, which says, think back on the voice you selected at the start of this interview. Your wild, semi-feral kid voice. And now try another age, 5 years before or after the first one. What happens to the voice?
Oh, man, it's such a good question. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from the whole book is to play with all these voices. Arrgh, what would I say to a pirate if I was doing the show as a pirate, right? And it's so true. We are multiple identities. And, you know, my research is like the importance of all the communities our kids belong to and all the voices they hear in those communities that kind of get filtered through that one kid. I think we just need to be better listeners to the world around us and how things are communicated. And teach kids that, you know, teach college writers that. And that's how you become a better writer. And also pushing back a little bit on the rigidity of academic writing, which I'll talk to you a little bit off the air about something I've been thinking about, but I just push back, right? Push back about scripted curriculums, push back against that there is a proper way to do things, because some of the best ways to get at a great piece of writing is to fight it, right? Bring out that punk, right? Bring out that. All right. I'm going to hand it over to Tanya because I could go on forever.
He's really showing some restraint today. I too have pages and pages full of notes. I just want to thank you, Sonya, for being on our show today and for putting this book out in the world for teachers. And I'm sure we will reach out to you and see if you're interested in sharing with the network in some other ways as well, because this is such a wonderful and beautiful writing project tool. I also want to, I just want to say also that you really blew my mind a couple times. Like this idea that workshop started with the fiction workshop, and we've like twisted it to other means without really thinking about the differences. I'm going to be thinking about that for days and days for sure. And I have really also been pushing about, in my role, about doing work that goes beyond academic writing for young people, but the authority with which you said, how can that be their authoritative voice? They're not academics. That's a setup is really powerful. So there are many other things, including I also always want to be Annie Dillard. So that made me happy. Yes. Michelle, you were amazing. You had great questions and it was a lovely conversation. I really appreciate the way that you prepared for it and then brought Sonya through this interview to the National Writing Project Network. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
My final job always is to thank listeners. So we're really glad you're here, and I bet you are too. And I bet you are right now not even listening to me because you're ordering a copy of this book. And that,
University of Nebraska Press.
If you love The Right Time, make sure you don't miss any episodes. Sign up for our newsletter at nwp.org. Sign up right now. Join our teacher writer community at thestudio.nwp.org, or follow our podcast so you never miss an exciting episode like this one. Thank you, everybody.
Radio.
You're listening to NWP Radio, a production of the National Writing Project.
NWP. NWP Radio.